Yeah, good evening. Sorry for this delay, which was really beyond our control. So I will be very brief in my introduction. We will have tonight two presentations, which sound very interesting. The first one will be from Dr. Toby Greene, who is a research fellow at the Leonard David Institute. He has a PhD from University College London. He's coming originally from Manchester. His PhD was on British policy on the Israeli-Palestinian arena under Tony Blair. And tonight he will speak about changing politics of foreign policy in Europe. Please, Toby.
Thank you, Gisela. Thank you very much for inviting me. As you've heard, I'm going to speak about the changing politics of foreign policy in Europe. But I think we all know as academics that our research comes with a personal motivation. So I want to briefly tell you about myself, which I think will help to explain.
You're just in the middle of the
If I maybe stand for
Okay, thank you.
So I want to tell you a little bit about myself, which I think helps explain what motivates my research. So I made Aliyah 12 years ago, but I grew up in the UK, as you've heard, and as well as being an Israeli citizen, I'm also still a British citizen and a European Union citizen, but unfortunately, probably only for another 93 days, as it stands. Who's counting? I completed my PhD in 2011, but I only became a full-time academic in 2015. Before that, I worked in a range of political roles. I was an advisor to members of parliament in the British Labour Party. After I arrived in Israel, I worked for a team of political consultants on political campaigns with various governing parties and heads of government in several European countries, including Austria, Serbia and Romania. I was then research director based in Israel for a British Middle East think tank called BICOM, and I've also worked on political campaigns and with political leaders here in Israel. I think it's because of my direct experience of politicians and decision makers that when I think about explaining international relations, which is my field, I tend to think about decision makers and what influences them. In international relations, this falls within the subfield of foreign policy analysis, which is about trying to understand the impact of domestic political factors on foreign policy decisions. And these factors include the personality and psychology of and worldviews of decision makers, public opinion, political culture, the role of political parties, and political and bureaucratic institutions. In my PhD thesis, which I published as a book in 2013, Blair, Labour and Palestine, I showed that in the case of British policy in the Israeli-Palestinian arena during Tony Blair's premiership, the underlying worldview of the Prime Minister was critical to determining policy outcomes. I built on this in a paper I published in Foreign Policy Analysis in 2017, in which I published in Foreign Policy Analysis in 2017, in which I used Blair's response to the Second Lebanon War in 2006 as a case study to explore the conditions in which a political leader will act according to their convictions, even when it causes severe harm to their domestic political position, something which runs against the general theoretical expectations in the literature on foreign policy decision-making. However, I actually think that that is getting harder and less likely, and now I want to turn to the main subject of this presentation. It's getting harder because, I would argue, even in the last 10 to 15 years, the very nature of foreign policy decision-making is changing fundamentally, and this is especially so in Europe. I want to argue that what I call the world of the decision-maker is changing, and this demands some fundamental re-evaluations of what drives foreign policy decisions. Now, there are many factors involved in that, but I want to highlight two, or group them into two sets of factors for this presentation. The first is the nature of political contestation in Europe is changing. We have new social cleavages or divides, therefore new political cleavages, and I argue that these impact on foreign policy debates and decisions. And secondly, the nature of political communication is changing because of social media and media fragmentation, which is changing the relationship between politicians and voters. Now, these two sets of factors are making, I believe, European foreign policy questions more polarised, more politicised within and between EU states. And this, I argue, helps explain a particular problem, which is why, despite huge institutional efforts to create a common EU foreign and security policy, this still proves very difficult to achieve. So the first claim I want to make is that the growing divide that we have seen in European politics in the last 10 to 15 years includes a divide over European identity, what Europe stands for. It's not just a debate about European integration versus national sovereignty, it's also a debate about what Europe actually is. And I argue this impacts on national and EU foreign policy debates, decisions and justifications. A dominant thesis on EU foreign policy in the last 10 to 15 years is the concept labelled by Ian Manners, normative power Europe. This is the idea that the EU's identity shapes its character as a normative actor that works to diffuse, to spread the values of democracy and human rights around the world, including through the power of example. But the normative power Europe thesis relates to a particular idea of Europe, and that idea, that conception, is increasingly challenged. There is a struggle in Europe today between at least two versions of European identity, of what Europe stands for. So Thomas Rees described this distinction quite neatly in a recent work. So to quote him here, there is a modern EU Europe supported by the European elites and embracing modern democratic and humanistic values against the past of nationalism, militarism or communism. On the other hand, there is a Europe of white Christian peoples that sees itself as a distinct civilization in the sense of Huntington. This, of course, a reference to Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations thesis. This European identity construction is less open to strangers and entails boundaries against Islam, as well as Asian or African cultures. Now, the outcome of two EU debates in the early 2000s, the decision not to include a reference to Christianity in the draft EU constitution, and the decision to allow Turkey to become a candidate country, were indicators that the modern EU version of Europe was then the dominant trend among EU elites, that Europe was to be defined by liberal democracy, not any particular faith or culture or civilization. However, this universalistic idea of Europe is increasingly contested by an extreme version of the alternative civilizationist idea, and this is fueled by several developments. One set of factors is the multiple economic, political, security and legitimacy challenges within the EU. This includes the anti-globalization backlash, coupled of course with the rising threat of Islamist extremist violence and migration waves from the Arab world, and we've seen the major impact of Euroscepticism in Brexit, of course. Another set of factors are changes in the international system. The US is withdrawing from its role as leader of the West. We are moving to a multipolar international system with the rise of China, the increasing assertiveness of Russia, the Islamization of Turkey. So the pillar of many European states' identity, that they are part of a liberal, democratic, free market West, is weakening dramatically before our eyes, especially since the election of Donald Trump, but it did not begin with Trump. Another development to notice as a general feature of globalization, and especially in Europe, is that the divide between domestic and foreign policy domains is eroding, and international issues are becoming more significant for the day-to-day lives of voters. The obvious examples in Europe being European integration, migration, and jihadist violence. And of course, these issues are central to the discourse of rising populist nationalist parties. And so in many cases, we see those parties increasingly position themselves as defenders not just of their particular nation, like populist nationalists in the past, but more broadly as defenders of a wider civilization. Rogers Brubaker, in a recent paper, describes this as a partial shift from nationalism to civilizationism, driven, he writes, by a striking convergence in the last 15 years around the notion of a civilizational threat from Islam. Now, I think this connects to arguments recently made in the international relations literature by constructivist scholars such as Peter Katzenstein, Patrick Thaddeus-Jackson, and Elizabeth Hurd, who argue in different ways that civilizations do not have any fixed essence, as Samuel Huntington implied when he wrote about the clash of civilizations in the 1990s. Rather, civilizational identity is socially constructed for political purposes. And I think that's happening in Europe right now. Populist nationalist politicians are trying to create a taken-for-granted sense of European civilization or values and define it in such a way as to exclude Islam and to serve their own political purposes. So take, for example, this speech by Dutch politician Geert Wilders, who said last year, "History calls on us all to save Europe, to save our own humanistic Judeo-Christian culture and civilization, our liberties, our nations, the future of our children. Politicians from all of the established parties are promoting our Islamization. It's not their country, it's our country. And it is unacceptable that you fear for the future of your children, that women are afraid, that Jews, ex-Muslims, Christians fear for their safety." Now, there are a couple of things to highlight here. First, it's interesting to note that Wilders and other European populist nationalists often refer to Judeo-Christian civilization rather than just Christian civilization. This is a feature of this civilizational identity project that has not been fully explored, and I argue in a paper that I recently presented to the Israel Association for the Study of European Integration that this term, Judeo-Christian, is somewhat dubious from a historical or theological perspective, and it has long served primarily a political purpose. In the United States in the mid-20th century, it served a liberal political agenda to include Jews, Catholics and Protestants in a shared civic identity and to differentiate from anti-Semitism, Nazism and communism. But in 21st century Europe, it serves a very different, illiberal political agenda. For the populist nationalists, it serves a double political purpose. First, it helps emphasize that Muslims are outside the boundaries of European identity, and it serves a second political purpose of helping distance populist nationalist parties from politically harmful, far-right and anti-Semitic origins, associations or suspicions. Indeed, the populist nationalists often position themselves as the defenders of the Jews and Israel, which I'm going to come to, against the new threat to the ethnic integrity of the nation or the civilization, which is not the Jews but the Muslims, who they claim are the real anti-Semites. Indeed, here, under the hat, in front of the menorah, is Viktor Orban, who calls for liberal democracy in Europe to be replaced with what he calls Christian democracy, but nonetheless proudly opens a reconstructed synagogue in Subotica, Serbia, where he spoke about defending Europe, which rests, in his words, on Jewish and Christian heritage. The important point to notice here is that this identity construction positions the populist nationalists as the defenders of the true Europe, against Muslims and against all those mainstream politicians who are, says Wilders, promoting our Islamization. Now, this transnational identity divide is one of several developments which are weakening any consensus about foreign policy goals, not just between European states, but within European states. But it's not the only factor. The shared national interest is also being called into question within European states because they are more ethnically diverse, with growing subnational communities with complex transnational loyalties. This includes, most importantly, growing Muslim minorities, but also Jewish and other minorities. And in a paper I published with Yossi Shine in 2016, I explored how the identity of Jews in Britain and France are increasingly Israelized, meaning shaped by Israeli affairs. But to return to my central point, we have a divide in European societies about how to define Europe, between a modern EU Europe and civilizational Europe. And my question is, does this divide impact how decision makers interpret and respond to foreign policy questions, and does it explain difficulties in achieving a common EU foreign policy? Now, there are many areas where this divide may impact foreign policy: migration, of course, attitudes towards Russia, towards Muslim states, Islamist violence, security versus human rights dilemmas, attitudes towards the US and others. But the issue I'm going to focus on today as a case study through which to observe the effects of this identity divide is European attitudes towards Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian arena. In literature on European integration, this issue is long recognized as a test of the EU's capabilities as a coherent foreign policy actor. On the screen here you can see a paper that I published in Survival earlier this year, which addresses the question why, despite an apparent consensus on a two-state solution and a commitment to a common foreign and security policy, there is such variation within and between EU states on political attitudes towards Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian issue. The challenge, if you like, is to explain this map here. This map shows how EU member states voted on Palestine being recognised as a non-member state in the UN General Assembly in November 2012. The green states here voted yes, the orange states abstained, and one state, the Czech Republic, they're coloured blue, voted no. Now, here's your common foreign and security policy for you. Now, I've added here on the slide a quotation from a diplomat from an EU member state who I interviewed in Brussels last year, who told me, "We all agree on the outcomes of an Israeli-Palestinian peace deal, but the moment we touch on how to get there, we fall apart." Now, this is not an isolated incident. This table shows 6 UN General Assembly votes in the last 9 years, in which there was a deep split between EU members. Now, each issue and context here is different, but basically, where you see a vote here coloured blue, that's a EU member state vote leaning towards Israeli preferences, and of course, the preferences of Israel's chief supporter, the United States. Where you see green, it's a vote leaning towards the preferences of the Palestinians and their diplomatic supporters, including Arab and Muslim states. The question is, can we figure out overall what causes each state to fall one way or the other on these votes which split the EU? Now, there are obviously many factors which influence each state's preferences. Each state has its own set of national interests, including economic and security ties, relations not only with Israel but with the US, other EU members or the Arab world. There are variations of national political culture which are not connected directly to the current identity divide which I've been describing. In Germany is the obvious example where diplomatic support is rooted in its own history, the history of the Holocaust, of course. There are also variations in the significance of ethnic and religious minorities, Muslim or even Jewish minorities, for example. But there are also variations of ideological worldview, of individual politicians or the parties or constituencies that they represent, including the identity variation which relates to the idea of Europe, which is a factor, I would argue, shaping how decision makers interpret international issues. It seems apparent that if as a party or decision maker you have more affinity with the modern EU Europe, generally on the left, you'll be more open to viewing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as Palestinians and their supporters would like you to, as being about the denial of Palestinian rights at the hands of Israel. And this perspective has been fueled for some, especially in Western Europe, by Israel's shift to the right and the decline of the peace process. And of course, on the far left, as in Britain, we see an extreme form of anti-Zionism. On the other hand, if you have more affinity with a civilizational view of Europe, up to a point, generally on the right, you're more likely to be open to the broad Israeli narrative, that Israel is a kin state on the front line of against anti-Western Islamist movements, including Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic State in the Sinai, and Iran. And this perspective has been fueled by events in the wider Middle East, the Arab state upheaval, growing radicalization, the Sunni-Shia polarization, and the spillover into Europe, of course, with mass migration waves and growing and terrorism. All of which have strengthened Israel's claim to be a key strategic partner for EU states. There are important counterexamples to that dichotomy, including Tony Blair, as it happens, but as a generalization, I think it holds. But is it possible to show that these variations of foreign policy choices are caused to some degree by that identity divide that I've been discussing? It's very difficult to attribute a foreign policy decision to any one factor. There are usually many factors involved, but one way I'm trying to tackle that question is a quantitative study with colleagues at Bar-Ilan University analysing EU member state choices on votes relating to the Israeli-Palestinian issues and looking for correlations with some of the factors that I just mentioned. Now that's a work in progress, but just to give you a hint, here is European Social Survey data from 2014 on attitudes towards Muslim immigration. This survey asked citizens of 20 EU states, and Israel too as it happens, how many Muslims should be allowed to come and live in your country? And the options were none, a few, some, or many. And what you will notice here is that the two states by far the most resistant to Muslim immigration, the Czech Republic and Hungary, are also outstanding in their diplomatic support for Israel, and the only two that have seriously considered following the US and moving their embassy to Jerusalem. Now, correlation, of course, does not establish causation, and of course there are many factors specific to each country, but I would suggest there is a link between the extent of the rising role of anti-Islamic rhetoric or sentiment in a country and the way people in that country interpret the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and other Middle East events. But there is another kind of evidence that we can look for when trying to uncover causal processes in complex events like foreign policy decisions. And that is qualitative case study research, which is more the kind of research that I usually do. In the last year, I've done fieldwork in Austria and also in Ireland, but it's the Austria case study that I want to refer to because one way to show the impact of this new political cleavage on European foreign policy is to look at states where there is a major shift in the ideology of the parties in government. And in a case like that, the material factors that might shape foreign policy decisions, economic and security ties, geography, demography, all remain fixed, but the decision makers change, both the individuals and the parties and constituencies that they represent. In Austria, we've seen this kind of change in 2018 with the entry of the populist Nationalist Freedom Party into the coalition. First of all, it's interesting to note how the Freedom Party leader Hans Christian Strache has adopted the Judeo-Christian discourse I mentioned earlier. This was following a visit to Yad Vashem in 2016. I always say, if one defines the Judeo-Christian West, then Israel represents a kind of border. If Israel fails, Europe fails. And if Europe fails, Israel fails. Strache, like Wilders and others, has embraced Israel as a symbol of the anti-Islamic front, which also helps to distance himself and his party from neo-Nazi origins. His coalition partner, Sebastian Kurz, has also positioned himself as one of the most supportive leaders in Europe with respect to Israel. Now, if I show the table again, you'll see in all the examples of votes relating to this, to the Israeli-Palestinian issue that split the EU 28, for the first time in June 2018, Austria leaned towards an Israeli preference. This was actually a resolution condemning Israel over the deaths of Gazans on the Israel-Gaza border, in which Austria abstained. In June, I conducted a number of interviews in Vienna, including with Foreign Minister Karin Kneißl. And I asked her what trajectory she saw with respect to attitudes towards Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian arena in Austria. And she told me the year 2015 was a watershed line when we had this massive immigration from the Middle East, when we had a rise in terror attacks in Europe. I would say the overall perception of Israel and how Israel is dealing with Hamas, for instance, has changed. And this is something that is encapsulated in how certain politicians in Austria see Israel as a role model. How do you handle terrorism and how do you continue normal life despite terrorist threats? I would say there is a growing understanding. So this quotation further illustrates the link between the rising sense of threat from jihadist violence in Europe and sympathy towards Israel. So to summarise, new forms of political contestation in Europe include a divide about what Europe is, the modern EU Europe versus civilizational Christian or Judeo-Christian Europe, and this impacts how EU decision makers interpret and respond to international challenges, and we see this illustrated in the case of attitudes towards the Israeli-Palestinian question, one of the consequences being there is no coherent EU common foreign security policy regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So that is about changes in the nature of political contestation, but I also want to say something about the other development I mentioned, changes in the nature of political communication, which I argue make these divides within European societies even more significant. Now, my research background is not in communications per se, but I see this from my professional experience in political communications and from my research in foreign policy decision making. And I would argue that foreign policy is increasingly politicised and polarised in domestic politics, not only because the shared concept of the national interest has eroded, but because new media has transformed how people consume and respond to political events and how political leaders communicate and act. Firstly, 24-hour news and now internet news and social media have increased real-time public awareness of global events and elite exposure to public opinion. Those same technologies are part of a process of media fragmentation. Rather than everyone consuming essentially the same news, websites and social media now tailor the news to meet your preferences, and this increases social divides over national agendas. To illustrate the consequences of this, I cannot do better than to quote Henry Kissinger in his brilliant 2014 book, World Order, in which he writes, "The global scope and speed of communication erode the distinction between domestic and international upheavals, and between leaders and the immediate demands of the most vocal groups. Events whose effects would once have taken months to unfold ricochet globally within seconds. Policymakers are expected to have formulated a position within several hours and to interject it into the course of events where its effects will be broadcast globally by the same instantaneous networks. The temptation to cater to the demands of the digitally reflected multitude may override the judgment required to chart a complex course in harmony with long-term purposes." So when it comes to foreign policy questions, decision makers are becoming more reactive, not only to the electorate as a whole, but to the most vocal or politically significant constituency. And this can have some interesting effects. In 2015, I published a paper in International Affairs called Israel's Two States Debate, which showed how party political differences within a coalition can lead to incoherent Israeli policy in the Israeli-Palestinian arena. And a new paper that has just been accepted to the European Journal of International Relations builds on this and uses comparative case studies from Britain and Israel to develop a general theory for something that I call rogue decisions. Rogue decisions are autonomous decisions impacting foreign affairs taken by junior parties contrary to the foreign policy agendas of their senior coalition partners, using devolved ministerial powers to act without cabinet coordination. And this is mainly done to satisfy the political or ideological concerns of their own narrow political constituency, a tendency which I expect to become more common due to these changes in the nature of political communications. So, to sum up my two central propositions, we have new forms of political contestation, and in particular this new civilizationism, which is increasing polarization within and between EU states on foreign policy questions, and at the same time, new forms of political communication, exacerbating social fragmentation and making politicians more sensitive and reactive to their specific constituency. For me, the research task going forward is to explore systematically the changing nature of foreign policy debates, justifications, and decisions in European states. My next major research project, for which I've submitted Horizon 2020 funding proposal, will compare British, French, and German debates regarding the question of humanitarian intervention against the Assad regime in Syria. And I want to compare between those states, but I also want to analyse how political debates have changed over time by comparing debates over intervention in Syria with similar debates about humanitarian intervention in the Balkans conflict in the 1990s. So I hope that that project will enable me to develop new theories about foreign policy decision-making in Europe in this era of new forms of political contestation and new forms of political communication. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Toby, for your insights, and I think this Horizon 2020 proposal could be very interesting because the Balkan intervention still happened in the last century.
Yeah.
So you will have exactly these 20 years of difference, and these changes could be quite evident in such a research. Tobias.
Thank you very much for this fascinating presentation, which was so rich with so many great ideas. I just want to say that I like this phrase, foreign policy anarchy. I think it summarizes also very well your point. As you also talked a little bit about communicative elements, I feel that I might say something too. I want to refer to this is just a comment or an annotation to two pictures you showed. These heads of Orban and Strache. And I just want to emphasize that this is also a perfect example for this kind of double addressing strategy of these populists, because they compile with the demands of covering their heads, but they would never ever wear a kippah. So for their radical electorate, they show no, I don't obey to them and I don't wear a kippah. And for their pro-Israeli electorate, they say, see, we are now the best friends of the Jews and the Israelis. And Strache made this in 2010 when he went to Yad Vashem. He did it a little bit more radical when he used his fraternity hat in order to cover his head. But what I wanted to ask is, how far is the Israeli case here really essential, and how far it is maybe more a kind of sideshow or an Elavi case? So my question is, how far is this? An Elavi. How far is the construction of this civilizationist European identity which you described maybe much more really a response or reaction to decisions made within Europe itself? So European civilization versus EU bureaucracy, positive heritage versus negative memory, illiberalism versus overemphasis of human rights. And one point which I think shows this a little bit is that these parties very much step in this great offer of the Israeli government to do only symbolic things. So I think the Israelis also changed a little bit into the direction of symbolic policy. And it's very easy to complain with this, but the question is, would this also lead towards the fact that Hungary and Austria will replace the American troops when they move away from Syria? That would be a kind of real move.
You want to break immediately, or let's maybe collect a few questions here.
Okay, I have two quick questions. First one, have you related to the EU as a union, and how does it affect as a supranational body? Like, does the Roga decision affect Mogherini, per se, on decisions on Israel? This is the first one. Second one is, how do you treat Germany, which in your graph can seem being on the far right, not politically, but just physically, since it has the wild card of the Holocaust? How does it affect it in the, let's say, in the play base of the decision making on foreign policies?
I wanted to understand if what you're saying is that the identity of the Judeo-Christian, this identity is a sort of reconstruction, a current new reconstruction by these populist politicians. And if this is what you said, I hope I understood, have you checked the Bible and the New Testament? Because if you really look at the Bible and the New Testament, you can see that this is not a political reconstruction, but actually the Word in the Bible and the New Testament. And I know that, I mean, at the beginning of Christianity, there was a sort of other theology that was interpreting the Word itself. But when you look at the Word, you can see the connection, the line between the Jewish Bible and the New Testament, and presenting Jesus as the Messiah of the Jews and the God of Israel. So this was
Okay, thank you. Short, and to continue on what Tobias was asking, what is the role of interest? Because you present it as an identity issue, but we do see the Visegrad countries, and Poland and Hungary especially, they're in a conflict within the EU. And they use the Israeli case to stick it in the eyes of the EU.
Right.
So it's an instrumental use of foreign policy within the EU decision-making that makes it's for their own good. So where is the realism in this, in all this?
Thank you very much, Toby. Just a quick question. You have two explanations there. The second, political communication, refers to decision-making anywhere. The first one, nature of political contestation, seems to refer to collective decision-making in Europe. How can you apply something similar but to individual decision-makers in specific European countries? Because it seems that this contestation has to do with Europe, like that question about as a collective decision-making. If you understood what I meant.
You did.
I think so. I hope so.
So, please.
Okay, quite a few things to refer to there. Okay, so Tobias, your question was about whether these kind of political positionings are kind of symbolic or real, or they really have teeth or significance. I mean, I think two kinds of answers to the question. The first is, the positions taken by, the reason I use UN General Assembly votes to illustrate this is because you can see them publicly, right? Because the member states have to come out publicly with a vote one way or another. They have to make a decision. But where does it actually really matter more significantly? It's actually when they debate behind closed doors. If you talk to member state diplomats in Brussels, they'll tell you about the like-minded states, about the groups of states, about how they gang together, basically. And this has real impact on the relationship and the development of the relationship between the EU and Israel, whether it develops with association councils and meetings and new agreements, or whether they move towards imposing sanctions on settlements or whatever. That debate has a real tangible impact. But you can't. But it's like a sausage, right? They make it behind closed doors. You can't see how it's made. So it's harder to show the divides between the states. But yes, those divides have real tangible, meaningful impact. And if you move it beyond the Israeli-Palestinian question, which I think maybe you were also hinting at, I think there are many policy areas where this identity divide can have an impact. And the Israeli-Palestinian issue is just kind of an example. I mentioned a couple big issues like migration, relations with Turkey, but other issues like relations with Russia, for example. Does it matter to you that Russia is an illiberal state? Well, the extent to which you care about liberalism, I think, is going to impact the extent to which you care about whether or not Russia is a liberal state and how you relate to Russia. So, for an example, how you relate to intervention in Syria, this project that I hope to move on to, for Marine Le Pen, she doesn't much care about Assad's human rights abuses. She cares about destroying Islamic State, and Assad's the least bad option. So, that's.
Therefore, it's interesting that for example, the FPÖ is really avoiding taking a stance on the question of Iran and or on the question of intervening in Syria. although they say that they support Israel. And this is what I meant. So this would really harm their electorate if they start a war or if they engage.
Right. So obviously, I mean, but that's also, I guess, a reflection of what is foreign policy in Austria and Hungary. These are small states with limited capabilities. That's a bigger question about America has a lot more foreign policy than Hungary and Austria. I think that the question at the back was about the EU as a union. So, I mean, the way I see European Union foreign policy decision making, the way those involved with it talk about it, is it comes from the member states, basically. This is still an issue that requires unanimity to make significant decisions in EU foreign policy. So the states have primacy when it comes to EU foreign policy. So to understand EU foreign policy, you still, despite these developments and institutional developments with Mogherini and the External Action Service, you still have to go back to what's happening in the member states when it comes to foreign policy. And you also asked about Germany. I mentioned Germany briefly, and I think this may relate also to some of the other questions. I'm certainly not saying that this identity divide is the factor which defines foreign policy preferences. What I'm saying, and this also relates to the question about interests, it's a factor which should be considered as significant alongside many other factors. And I stressed that a couple of times because I think it's very important. When you look at foreign policy decisions, they are very complex things to tease out. That's one of the research challenges from my perspective. How can you determine the impact of the worldview of the decision maker, the institutional factors, the national interests, the pressures, log rolling, horse trading within the EU itself, which affects foreign policy decisions? That's a real challenge, which is part of my research challenge, to try and extract one factor from the other. But essentially my hypothesis or my claim is that this factor is one among others, which has played some kind of a role there. And a question about, so I hinted at my skepticism about this Judeo-Christian construction, and you challenged that. In my research question is not really primarily to explore whether there really is such a thing as a Judeo-Christian. There really is a set of values or a civilization which is defined by something common to Judaism and Christianity that isn't found in Islam or any other religion, cultural civilization. I hinted that I'm skeptical about that, and I am, but it's not the central to my research question. My claim is really that those people who are using this construction are not really, I don't think, making a substantial claim about the roots of European civilization. I think they're using it for a political purpose.
Even if they are asked about that, they don't know really what to answer. When they were asked, what do you mean with it? Most of the politicians then go completely blank, or they refer only to Christianity.
Right, and even more than that, it's the vagary around this term. It's the fact that it's very ill-defined that makes it possible for them to take it and reapply it for their own political use. It's what Patrick Thaddeus Jackson calls a rhetorical commonplace. It's a term that's out there. People know that's a sort of thing to identify with, even though it has a very, very loose definition.
It's not vague and loose at all.
I think
How it is used, it's vague and
It's
loose.
very rooted in the Bible and the New Testament.
How it's used.
And people that do believe in it
So,
are, they're very clear. I don't know about the politicians, but the people who are, part of this belief system are not making, they're all saying the same thing.
So in my paper which I'm drafting, I quote Bernard Lewis, who writes of this notion of a Judeo-Christian tradition that it would have shocked many of the forebears of both Judaism and Christianity until quite recently, until the modern era, Christian Europe defined itself in opposition to Jews and Muslims in different ways. I think I'm not sure I'm not sure we should get too deeply into that debate. It's not central to my thesis, but I remain quite skeptical about that. And Ari, I'm not sure if I fully answered your question. If I came to, but I think the divide that I'm describing, I believe, applies within member states, and because of the structure of EU foreign policy decision making that I described, therefore, is a further challenge to the development of a common EU foreign and security policy. I don't know if that addresses your question.
I'm afraid we're running out of time. If I may, James, there's another. Thank you very much, Toby.